The cold wind swept through the busy city streets as people rushed past, their coats wrapped tightly around them. Neon signs flickered, cars honked in the distance, and the world moved on as if it didn't see her. But there she was, sitting on the sidewalk, her arms wrapped around herself for warmth. Her name was Margaret, but no one asked. To most, she was invisible, just another homeless woman lost in the background of a city that never stopped moving. Margaret had once lived a different life, one filled with love, comfort, and security. But life had a cruel way of changing overnight. A tragic accident, a few bad decisions, and a series of misfortunes had stripped everything away from her. Now, she relied on the kindness of strangers, though kindness was rare. Most people ignored her. Others looked at her with disgust, whispering, judging, as if they knew her story without ever hearing a single word. Then came the moment that would change everything. A tall, sharply dressed woman walked briskly down the street. Her designer heels clicked against the pavement with purpose, her sleek black coat hugging her frame like it was made for power. Emily Crawford. She was everything Margaret wasn't. Successful, confident, respected. She had built an empire from the ground up, turning a small investment into a multi-million-dollar business. She had no time for distractions, no patience, for things that slowed her down. And then she saw Margaret. It wasn't sympathy that filled Emily's eyes. It was irritation. Margaret had her small collection of belongings spread out next to her. A tattered blanket, a few plastic bags, an old coffee cup with a few coins rattling inside. She wasn't begging, but her presence alone seemed to bother Emily. With a disgusted sigh, Emily stopped in front of her. "You people have no shame, do you?" she scoffed, her voice cold and sharp. Margaret looked up slowly, her tired eyes meeting Emily's. "I'm just trying to get by," she said softly. Emily shook her head. "Get by? Sitting here, making the city look like a dump. You expect people to just hand you everything while the rest of us work for it?" Margaret's heart sank. She had heard things like this before, but each time it cut just as deep. She wanted to tell Emily her story, to explain that she had worked, that she had tried, that she had lost everything in ways she never saw coming. But she knew it wouldn't matter. People like Emily had already made up their minds. The businesswoman scoffed again, pulling a crisp bill from her expensive leather purse. "Here," she said, dropping it onto the ground. "Go buy yourself some dignity." Then, without another glance, she walked away, her heels clicking even louder, as if making a point. Margaret stared at the bill lying in the dirt. She wasn't sure whether to take it or leave it. It wasn't about the money. It was about the way it was given, like she wasn't even human. That night, as she curled up against the cold concrete, her mind replayed the moment over and over. The humiliation, the shame, the way Emily had looked at her, like she was nothing. She thought about the life she once had, the dreams she used to believe in, and for the first time in a long time, she felt something different. Not just sadness, not just regret. She felt determination, because tomorrow was a new day. And what Emily Crawford didn't know was that life had a way of turning tables when people least expected it, and by the time the sun rose again, nothing would ever be the same. The city woke up to another cold morning. Margaret sat up, stretching, her aching limbs, feeling the stiffness in her joints from sleeping on the hard pavement. The streets were already alive with people hurrying to work, their eyes avoiding hers, as if she were nothing more than a shadow. But today felt different. The humiliation from the day before still burned in her chest, but instead of breaking her, it had ignited something deep inside. She wasn't just going to sit there and accept it. She grabbed her few belongings and stood up. She didn't know exactly what she was going to do, but she knew she couldn't let that moment define her. Somewhere inside, she still believed that life could change, that she wasn't meant to be forgotten on these streets forever. Meanwhile, across town, Emily Crawford was already in her high-rise office, drowning in emails, phone calls, and meetings. To her, the incident with Margaret was nothing more than a passing annoyance. Forgotten as soon as she walked away, her mind was focused on an upcoming business deal that could take her company to the next level. Investors were flying in, and everything had to be perfect. She had built her success on precision, discipline, and never letting anything or anyone slow her down. But life had a way of throwing surprises when people least expected it. As the day went on, Margaret wandered through the city, looking for anything, any opportunity, any open door. She passed by cafes, bookstores, office buildings, places she had once walked into without a second thought. Now, every entrance felt like a barrier, an invisible sign saying she didn't belong. But she kept going. Then, something caught her eye. A small diner on the corner, the smell of fresh coffee and warm bread drifting out onto the street. She hesitated before stepping. Inside, the warmth hit her instantly, wrapping around her like a forgotten memory. The man behind the counter looked up, surprised to see her. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone cautious, but not unkind. Margaret took a deep breath. "I'm looking for work," she said. "I'll do anything. Clean tables, wash dishes. I need a chance." The man, whose name was Peter, studied her for a long moment. He had seen her before, sitting outside on the streets. He had thought about helping, but never knew how. Now she was standing here, asking for a job. "I can't pay much," he said finally, "but if you're willing to work hard, I could use some extra hands in the kitchen." A flicker of hope lit up inside her. "I'll do my best," she promised. And just like that, Margaret took the first step towards something new. It wasn't much, but it was something. Days passed, then weeks. She scrubbed floors, wiped down counters, and washed dishes until her fingers were raw. She worked harder than she ever had before, determined to prove that she was more than just a woman on the streets. Peter noticed her dedication, the way she never complained, never asked for more than what she was given. Slowly, he started to trust her. He let her take orders, interact with customers, and then, one morning, everything changed. Margaret was behind the counter when the door swung open, and in walked Emily Crawford. Emily was on her phone, not even looking up as she approached the counter. "Large coffee, no sugar," she said briskly, pulling out her wallet. Margaret felt her breath catch, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't sure if Emily would recognize her. Emily glanced up, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. A flicker of confusion crossed her face. Then surprise. She hesitated. "You," she murmured, narrowing her eyes as if trying to place her. Margaret straightened her posture. "Your coffee will be right out," she said, evenly, her voice steady. Emily blinked, clearly thrown off. She glanced around as if making sure she was in the right place. "You work here?" she asked, her tone skeptical. Margaret nodded. "Yes." Emily frowned, like she was trying to process it. The last time she had seen Margaret, she had been sitting on the cold pavement, a handful of coins in a dirty cup. Now, she was standing behind a counter, wearing a clean apron, looking like she belonged here. Something about it unsettled Emily. "Interesting," she muttered, taking her coffee without another word. She turned to leave, but for the first time in a long time, something made her hesitate. She stole one last glance at Margaret before walking out the door, her mind spinning. For the rest of the day, Emily couldn't focus. She had spent years believing that people like Margaret were stuck in their situations because they didn't try hard enough. But now, seeing her there, working, standing tall, it challenged something inside her. The next day, she found herself back at the diner. Margaret saw her walk in and braced herself. She expected another insult, another cutting remark. But this time, Emily sat down at a booth. When Margaret approached with a notepad, Emily hesitated before speaking. "I'll have breakfast," she said, almost as if testing something. Margaret nodded, coming right up. As Margaret walked away, Emily found herself watching her. She didn't understand why she was so fixated, but she couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong about some things. Neither of them knew it yet, but this was only the beginning of something neither of them expected. As Margaret placed Emily's breakfast on the table, there was a brief silence between them. The tension that had once existed, the humiliation, the anger, had shifted into something neither of them could quite define. Emily picked up her fork, but didn't eat right away. Instead, she glanced up at Margaret. "You've changed," Emily said, almost to herself. Margaret met her gaze, unshaken. "I never stopped trying," she replied. Emily took a slow breath, tapping her fingers against the table. For years, she had built her life around the belief that success was earned through relentless work, and that those who struggled simply hadn't worked hard enough. But now, looking at Margaret, who had once been at rock bottom and was now standing in front of her, rebuilding her life, she realized how little she actually understood. Emily pushed her plate aside. "How did you do it?" she asked, the words coming out softer than she intended. Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and sat across from her. "It wasn't easy," she admitted. "People look at you differently. When you have nothing, they assume things about you. They treat you like you don't belong." She paused. "You treated me that way." Emily felt the sting of those words. But for once, she didn't try to justify herself. She had humiliated Margaret that day, made her feel small, yet here she was, still willing to sit down and have a conversation. Margaret continued, "But Peter gave me a chance. That's all it took. One person believing I could be more than what people saw on the outside." Emily sat with that thought for a moment. She had spent her whole career making ruthless decisions, believing that kindness was a weakness in business. But maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong about more than just Margaret. A week passed, and Emily found herself returning to the diner again and again. At first, she didn't understand why. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was guilt. Or maybe, deep down, she wanted to be different too. She started having real conversations with Margaret, learning about her past, the struggles that led her to the streets, and in turn, she shared pieces of her own life, how she had clawed her way to the top, how she had sacrificed friendships, love, even happiness for success. Then one morning, Emily walked in, holding a small envelope. She placed it on the counter, in front of Margaret. Margaret eyed it warily. "What is this?" Emily hesitated, almost nervous. "An opportunity." Margaret opened the envelope, her hands trembling slightly. Inside was a job offer from one of Emily's companies. Margaret looked up, stunned. "Why are you doing this?" Emily sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Because I was wrong," she admitted. "About you. About people like you. I don't want to just throw money at a problem and walk away. I want to be better." Margaret's eyes filled with emotion. But she wasn't someone who accepted charity. "I don't need pity," she said quietly. Emily shook her head. "This isn't pity. This is a second chance. One you've already earned." Margaret stared at the offer. the weight of the moment sinking in. She had worked so hard to get to this point, and now, for the first time in a long time, a door was opening. Not because someone felt sorry for her, but because someone finally saw her worth. Tears pricked the corners of her eyes, but she held them back. With a deep breath, she looked at Emily and nodded. "Okay," she said. "I'll take it." Emily smiled. Genuinely this time. "Good." As Margaret walked to the back of the diner to tell Peter the news, Emily sat at her usual table watching her go. For the first time in a long time, she felt something new. Not just success, not just power, but something real. She had come into this diner expecting nothing, but she was leaving with something she never knew she needed: change. And in that moment, both of their lives were never the same again.